assisted with initial balanced and restorative justice implementation efforts, or are working today to implement the principles of balanced restorative justice. I'd like to very briefly introduce each of them to you at this time. We've got a large panel, so way down on my left, to your right, is Jim Anderson, and these are going to be very brief introductions. Jim spent 36 years at the Juvenile Court Judges Commission, 28 as Executive Director, current member of the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, and chair of Pennsylvania's Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Committee. I'm going to be saying JJDPC a lot, so I'll tell you right now, the JJDPC is Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Committee of PCCD. Recipient of numerous state and national awards, including the JCJC's Judge Fred P. Anthony Award in 2014, upon his retirement from the system after 40 years. Next to Jim is Mary Taylor. Yeah, please hold your applause till the end. Mary was Chief Counsel for the House Judiciary Committee from 1983 to 1994, right during a period of special session. In 1995 to 2001, she served as Governor Ridge's Director of Criminal Justice Policy. She subsequently served as counsel to Senator Jeff Piccola and the Attorney General's Office, Chief Counsel to PCCD, and counsel to the Task Force on Child Protection in the wake of the Sandusky scandal. Now retired. John Delaney Jr. currently serves as the Deputy District Attorney leading the Trial Division in the Philadelphia DA's office. From 1990 to 2002, he served as the Deputy DA for the Juvenile Division, where he supervised the juvenile court, habitual offender, child support enforcement, and truancy prevention units. He represented the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association during the special session on crime and during the initial implementation efforts of the Act's mandates. During that time, he also served as a member of PCCD's Juvenile Advisory Committee, which was the precursor to PCCD's Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Committee. Next to John is Bob Schwartz. Bob co-founded the Juvenile Law Center 40 years ago in 1975. He served as Executive Director of the JLC from 1982 until his retirement last month. From 1996 to 2006, Bob was a member of the MacArthur Foundation's Research Network on Adolescent Development and Juvenile Justice, whose research helped end the juvenile death penalty 10 years ago. He was a member of the JJDPC for 21 years. In 1995, the Juvenile Law Center and Bob fought the most punitive legislative proposal, in his words, with limited success. He will be receiving the JCJC's Outstanding Leadership Award this evening. Next to Bob is Ron Sharp. Ron served our juvenile justice system for over 40 years. He's currently a part-time psychologist with Alternative Rehabilitation Communities, started his career in Cambria County as a juvenile probation officer. He joined the JCJC in 1971, but then left in 1974 to pursue his work as a psychologist. In 1977, Judge Anthony convinced him to return to the JCJC as its executive director. His vision and leadership led to the creation of our Center for Juvenile Justice Training and Research at Harrisburg University. In 1996, and we'll be talking about this in a few minutes, he was appointed by Governor Ridge to chair the Juvenile Advisory Committee, now known as the JJDPC of PCCD. And he served as chair of the JJDPC for almost 20 years. Ron received the JCJC's Judge Fred P. Anthony Award in 2013. Next to Ron Sharp is Jim Reland. Jim worked in the juvenile justice system for 40 years as well. We have a really distinguished panel. Many of these guys and ladies have worked for 40 years in our juvenile justice system. And just as an aside, when I got a chance to meet with them prior to, it was like a who's who of juvenile justice coming in. And if we ever started a Hall of Fame for juvenile justice, I think there'd be a lot of members on our panel today who would be members of our Hall of Fame. Anyway, Jim worked as the Director of Juvenile Probation Services in Allegheny County in 1997. He chaired the Chiefs Balanced and Restorative Justice Implementation Committee for the Chiefs Council for many years. In 2009, he was the recipient of the Dennis M. Maloney Award, only a second time we presented that award. He retired from Allegheny County in 2010, but continues to serve as a commissioner for PCCD. Next to Jim is Valerie Bender. Val, in her role as a crime victim advocate, has been actively involved in balanced restorative justice since 1995. And as an aside, I've worked with many advocates in different areas, mental health, families, whatever they are. Val's certainly one of the best I've ever met. She assisted in the first regional trainings on balanced restorative justice that highlighted the impact of crime on the crime victim. She participated in the drafting of the Bill of Rights for Victims of Juvenile Crime, primary author of the white paper, Advancing Accountability, Moving Toward Victim Restoration, and authored the Victim Community Awareness Curriculum. She really helped our juvenile justice system move forward. Next to Val is Susie Blackburn, currently Juvenile Court Policy and Program Development Specialist for the JCJC, served as Pennsylvania's statewide Balance and Restorative Justice Coordinator, and has been the central point of contact for balance and restorative justice in Pennsylvania for almost 20 years. She too previously served on PCCD's Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Committee and currently serves on the Victims Needs Assessment Subcommittee of PCCD's Victim Services Advisory Committee. Next to Susie is Russ Carlino, currently the Chief Juvenile Probation Officer in Allegheny County, currently serves as chair of the Chiefs Barge JJSES Implementation Committee. He's a member of the JJSES leadership team, a member of the PACT, that's Pennsylvania Academic and Career Technical Training Executive Steering Committee. Next to Russ is Judge Kim Clark. Judge Clark is currently the administrative judge of the Family Division in Allegheny County. She's also current chair of the Juvenile Court Judges Commission, my boss. She's also president of the Pennsylvania Pennsylvania Conference of State Trial Judges. That's an association of all of the judges in the state. She's a past president of the Juvenile Court section of the Pennsylvania Conference of State Trial Judges, member of the Supreme Court's Juvenile Court Procedural Rules Committee and Domestic Relations Procedural Rules Committee, and the Supreme Court's Interbranch Commission on Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Fairness. Also currently a member of PCCD's Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Committee. And finally, Judge Art Grimm served as judge of the Court of Common Pleas of Berks County and the administrative head of the Juvenile Court from 1987 to 2007. Was president judge in Berks County from 2004 to 2007. Was a member of the Juvenile Court Judges Commission for 18 years and was chairman of the JCJC for the past 10. He will be presented with the Judge Fred P. Anthony Award this evening. He is a member of the JJDPC of PCCD and was also appointed by Governor Corbett to serve on the Task Force on Child Protection. Would you please join me in recognizing this esteemed group of my colleagues? Thank you. Let me first begin by describing what happened 20 years ago in 1995. Governor Ridge called the legislature into a special session on crime the morning after his inauguration, the very morning after his inauguration. The anti-crime special session would last 10 months and run concurrent with the General Assembly's regular legislative session. The special term for the special session was a holdover from earlier days when the legislatures met infrequently and had to be convened solely to deal with special problems that had to be dealt with immediately. And it was true that crime, especially juvenile crime, was on people's minds at that time and was a central issue in the previous fall's gubernatorial campaign. In the years immediately preceding the special session, the nation had experienced an historic surge in crime, including juvenile violence. This is an issue of U.S. News and World Report. The cover from that day reads, "Teenage Time Bombs. Violent juvenile crime is soaring, and it's going to get worse," because of projected demographics at the time. The term super predators was also used at that time to describe juvenile offenders. According to data from the U.S. Department of Justice cited in one of the articles in this magazine, between 1985 and 1994, juvenile arrest rates for murder increased 150%, and weapons law violations and aggravated assault doubled. However, I would also point out that juvenile arrest rates for violent crime have consistently trended downward since that time. The special session on crime represented one of the most critical periods in the history of Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system. Many prominent reform proposals included terms like adult time for adult crime, and many states turned to their criminal justice systems as the answer. Some states reduced their upper age of juvenile court jurisdiction for all offenses to 17, some to age 16, and a few states even reduced their upper age of juvenile court jurisdiction for all offenses to age 15. In the end, 37 different pieces of legislation related to crime were signed into law during the special session, 15 of which affected the juvenile justice system in some way. Perhaps the most significant of which was Act 33, which redefined the very purpose of our juvenile justice system and has since served as a model that other states have replicated. And so we thought it fitting to gather together a group of individuals during the 20th anniversary of balanced restorative justice to tell the story behind the redefinition of the mission of our juvenile justice system. And so, let's begin. John Delaney, you were and are a prosecutor. You represented the District Attorneys Association at the time, which had a lot of influence in Capitol Hill. And how about if you start by talking a little bit about what juvenile crime was like at the time and the positions of the DA's Association?
I will. Thank you, Keith. Let me just start by saying what an honor it is to be at the James E. Anderson Annual Conference on Juvenile Justice and to be the only person at this table still working full-time.
They are close friends, and that was a jab.
The first of many. Violent crime overall was up in Pennsylvania. It was significantly up in Philadelphia. We hit our high watermark in 1992 when 502 Philadelphians were murdered. We were seeing 25 and 30 juveniles a year arrested for murder. In August of 1993, Lynn Abraham, who was then the elected DA of Philadelphia, convened a meeting of the District Attorneys Association in our office. And there were about 20 elected DAs there, I and another member of our staff, not elected, who helped facilitate the meeting, where we put 2 easels up in the room and listed all the things that the DAs liked and thought were admirable and efficient in working about the juvenile system, and everything they didn't like. And both lists were lengthy. And out of that came a resolve to try and change the way that juveniles were treated by the law. That included, in its essence, 3 basic elements. One was to take the older, more violent kids out of the juvenile justice system, because at the time, we were not doing a good job with them. We were sending them to places that were not very well run, that were not producing very good results, and our communities were not any safer as a result of that. And as much as I admire the juvenile justice system, the criminal justice system has one notable advantage: its ability to incapacitate. So we thought there was a small but significant number of juveniles that needed to be in the criminal justice system, which under the then regime where a juvenile court judge had to transfer a juvenile offender to criminal court, we didn't think was working. The second element, in addition to taking the older, more violent kids out of the system, was to remove the secrecy that surrounded the juvenile court. And that was evident in a whole bunch of ways. The fact that a very limited number of kids could be fingerprinted and photographed. One of the things we did when we went to legislatures, we showed them a case of a 13-year-old in Philadelphia who was arrested 14 times as a first offender until he got a repeat detective processing his arrest to realize he'd been there before. Because every time he got arrested, he wasn't fingerprinted because of his age, and he gave a different name and a different date of birth and a different address. And the third thing that the DAs wanted to do was reinvigorate the juvenile justice system. They knew it was doing a lot of good. But the phrase that was used at the time is that the Purposes Clause was philosophically bankrupt. And at the time, what the Purposes Clause of the Juvenile Act said about delinquent kids was, and I quote, "to remove from children committing delinquent acts the consequences of criminal behavior and to substitute, therefore, a program of supervision, care, and rehabilitation." And the DAs, while not sold that the criminal justice system was perfect, they believed that there were some effects of the criminal justice system that were salutary, like accountability, like punishment. Yet our law forbade those concepts from intervening in juvenile delinquency proceedings. So it's with those 3 themes in mind that specific proposals were crafted at the end of 1993 and communicated to the men who were then running for governor of Pennsylvania.
All right, that's a good segue. So Mary, so you are a Capitol insider. You were a Capitol insider.
I was a Capitol.
And you had a long tenure with the House Judiciary Committee. You ended up working for Governor Ridge, Senator Piccola. There was a political campaign going on at the time. and you were right in the middle of all of that. So why don't you talk a little bit about what you remember from back then?
Okay. First of all, the first campaign we were involved in was the primary race between then Attorney General Priate and Tom Ridge, who was a congressman from Washington. And Governor Ridge, then Congressman Ridge, decided that he was going to run on a crime platform which contained many components that are common terminology now. For example, Megan's Law, 3 strikes, the Uniform Firearms Act, the instant background check statute was formulated during the special session on crime, significant reforms of our rape statute in terms of sexual assault. So anyway, we were crafting this enormous crime platform for Governor Ridge because my boss was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Senator Jeff Picola from Dauphin County, who was a strong supporter of the governor in the primary, and the governor actually beat the Attorney General on crime, which was fairly extraordinary. We were the underdog in that race. The governor accepted the platform presented to him by the Attorney General, by the District Attorneys Association, but there was this natural progression and evolution of the content of the platform as we went from the primary into the general election, and through the primary and into the general, then United States Attorney for the Western District, Tom Corbett, who had left office and was in private practice, was chosen by Governor Ridge to be his advisor with regard to his criminal justice platform. So Governor Corbett, lots of governors involved here, Governor Corbett then went about putting together a team of advisors, of experts in criminal and juvenile justice, the best people we could identify throughout the Commonwealth to advise the governor in his ongoing development of his platform. Jim Anderson was the member on the committee advising the governor wannabe, Ridge, on what the elements of his juvenile justice platform should be, in collaboration with those district attorneys, primarily obviously Republican district attorneys from across the Commonwealth, who were advising the governor not only on the elements of his criminal justice platform, but on his juvenile justice platform as well. So we started that dialogue during the campaign with regard to another balanced approach in terms of direct file and what the DA saw as an urgent need to reform the juvenile justice system, and what our juvenile court judges were saying in response, through Jim, were saying in response to what the DAs were putting on the table at that time.
Okay, so Jim, so the storm clouds were gathering. I don't think it's too strong a statement to say that the history of the juvenile justice system was at stake. And what was your strategy?
Well, our strategy was to build on work that we had been doing through the leadership of Judge Casamatis, who had just finished his term as chair of JCJC and had been conducting regular meetings of a juvenile justice policy group down at Shippensburg University. We had developed principles both for prevention and juvenile justice intervention. And one of the key aspects of where to start with this is that Governor Ridge embraced then Governor-elect Ridge, virtually all of the DA's proposals as a starting point. So the Ridge crime plan that we were very familiar with, the DA's official position, which varied in some respects from what was in what became the Ridge crime plan, was of great concern to the Juvenile Court Judges Commission. We knew that the answer to juvenile justice system reform could not be the criminal justice system, and that was the starting point of our work. And we worked very hard in 1994, both within the process of trying to work with Mary and within the people who were advising the Governor-elect Ridge, and then, well, first the wannabe governor, the candidate, then Governor-elect. And in that process, after the governor became governor-elect, the Juvenile Court Judges Commission also had an in. And that's because Judge Fred Anthony knew then Governor-elect Ridge as a former public defender assistant and assistant district attorney from Erie County. So with Mary's help and Judge Anthony's help, the Juvenile Court Judges Commission met with Governor-elect Ridge on January the 10th. Of 1995. So this was before the inauguration, where we spoke in general terms about the juvenile justice system. Judge Anthony reminded Governor-elect Ridge of some of the work that he had done in Erie County. I think we had a very good meeting, and I think laid the foundation for wanting to work with the governor's office in terms of arriving at the what would ultimately be the solutions that were agreed to during this special session. And as Keith said, the governor called the legislature into special session the day following inauguration, and things took off from there. And with bills introduced in the House and the Senate, public hearings throughout the year, and ultimately the principles of balanced and restorative justice were the foundation of what became the most important aspect of the Juvenile Court Judges Commission philosophy for all of this, in that we had to work with the mission of our juvenile justice system as the foundation for our work. And that language was developed early in 1995 in final form, but it didn't get put into the key legislative pieces until the legislation reached the Senate. And it was through the Senate Judiciary Committee that we were successful and still working very closely with the governor's office. And the fact is, I'd known Mary since 1978, and we had been working together for many years. So I never was doing anything that Mary didn't know that I was doing. And even if it was not exactly where the governor's position was, she was never surprised by anything that we were doing. And so the key to all of this was building on the relationships that we had in the General Assembly. Once the legislation that was identified that would be the key juvenile justice piece that dealt with which kids should be tried as adults and how they should go to and from the juvenile justice system and to the criminal justice system and back. And we had, by the way, been working closely with the DA's Association. At that point, there were a number of meetings that had happened. A key meeting that happened was in the Senate late in that year, where a lot of us were together. The DA's Association was there, the Juvenile Court Judges Commission was there, and we trotted out Judge Ken Bean from Bucks County, former president of the District Attorneys Association, who could speak with authority and respect about the juvenile justice system, talk about what it meant to be successful in juvenile court. And that was really an important turning point, because Judge Bean could speak as a former DA and as president of the DA's Association, but also as a juvenile court judge. And that was really the point at which we were virtually certain we were going to be successful in getting the balanced and restorative justice language in our purpose clause. And at that point, we had already reached agreement with the DA's Association regarding which kids should start out in criminal court, and that there would be legislative criteria in our statute that judges would consider in making the decision to transfer to criminal court. There would be legislative criteria on excluding kids, and also that same criteria would be used to determine when kids would come back from criminal court if charged initially as adults. So that was a turning point in all of that. And Senate Bill 100, sponsored by Senator Mike Fisher, was key. And again, what was crucial in all of this were the staff support throughout. People who we had the privilege of working with for a long period of time, who made sure that at least we would get heard, and sometimes were able to get our position in front of a particular legislator at a key time. Relationships were the key.
All right, gotcha. Okay, so we've got the DAs with a proposal. You've got a gubernatorial election. JCJC's bringing out the big guns. We got some judges who are making presentations. Bob Schwartz, you were and are a passionate child advocate. And how was your message received, and what was your message?
Yeah, is this on? How do you turn this thing on? Here. Push.
It's on.
See, this is what happened in the 90s, is my mic was off most of the time. And that's how my message was received.
Thank you, Bob.
Yes, yes, it was, I thought, not a particularly good decade for the defense bar. I think we had fundamental differences over the value of the juvenile justice system and the ability of the criminal justice system to solve whatever problems were perceived to exist in juvenile court. We also tended to see kids as sort of individuals in a way whose cases needed to be decided individually, and felt strongly that not all kids accused of violent crime were the same and ought to be treated one-on-one by a judge making a decision about the public safety, amenability to treatment issues after evidence from both sides. That was considered a fairly old-fashioned notion by 1995. So that while we ultimately got to balanced and restorative justice, as you've heard, that's not where the discussion began. First of all, there were lots of things happening at the time. So there was a multiple lane highway in terms of what we saw as an assault on the juvenile justice system. Opening the juvenile court, opening up juvenile records, having the consequences of juvenile offenses last longer into adulthood, having more kids transferred into the adult system, having treatment have more of a punishment orientation as well as a rehabilitation orientation. So I know that I testified against one of the bills at the time, suggesting that any bill ought to address public safety, which is paramount, and we thought that juvenile justice system would address it better than the criminal justice system, ought to be cost-effective, ought to be fair, and had a number of other values that
Sounds reasonable, Bob.
that I thought were almost like biblical in nature. The chair of the committee before I testified said, Mr. Schwartz, I don't agree with a single thing you said. And he didn't, and neither did anybody else in the General Assembly at the time. So the bills were moving along, and what I do think happened is that the JCJC intervention, I would say, got people to a different point. Had a different discussion where you could address the issue of accountability in a different way, address the issue of incapacitation in a way that didn't make it a one-way decision. I mean, some of the early bills were like one of those parking lot entrances where the spokes are up and you can go one way, but you can't go back without puncturing a lot of tires. We ended up having a bill which started some kids in the adult system, but allowed for evidence-based hearings on whether it was in the public interest to send kids back. So by the end of the session, I thought we got to a point where most of the interests were taken into account, and I largely think that the driver behind that were the judges.
All right, let's open it up a little bit. So just for anybody on the panel, if you have any reflections about what was going on then leading up to the special session on crime. Mary, you look like you have the itch.
Just following up on Bob, the district attorneys had an extraordinary presence on the Hill. There were many members of the judiciary committees, both in the House and the Senate, who were either elected district attorneys or former ADAs. So there was an immediate receptivity to the District Attorneys Association coming to them, combined with the fact that they were elected representatives and that violent adult and juvenile violent crime rates were soaring in Pennsylvania as they were nationally. Everyone felt the need to respond in some way with new legislation. So what was extraordinary in my experience, I mean, my job was simply, as a generalist, to identify the best experts in Pennsylvania to come in and advise my members and to advise the governor, because at that time I was advising both the governor and the General Assembly. So the great grace of the Juvenile Court Judges Commission was that it gave me, through Jim, the best judges in Pennsylvania. And remember, we're an extremely, as you know, diverse geographic state, so it wasn't just Philadelphia. It was judges throughout the Commonwealth who came in and with great intellect and with great credibility advised the governor and advised the Senate and the House Judiciary Committees, so that you had this beautiful balance between the DAs, many of whom were very scholarly and gifted people, as well as the judges, and engaging in this dialogue, which was something very new in the General Assembly, and which has very happily, I believe, continued, and with much credit to Jim in terms of bringing the presence of JCJC with his credibility, because he was the frontline legislative staff, because it was a very small office and continues to be a very small office. So I just offer that.
And Keith, I would just add two things about the context that I think are important to note. One, Pennsylvania never got to the place that other states were. I mean, there were several other states, Arizona foremost among them, that were debating abolishing the juvenile delinquency system. and saying, okay, if you're 13 or younger and you commit what would be a crime, you're a dependent. If you're 14 or over, you go to criminal court, and there's no doorway to get back.
Right.
And the second thing was, there were a lot of things wrong with the juvenile justice system. I remember testifying in front of a Senate hearing where I showed them 5 examples, 5, of probation records in Philadelphia where the probationer had been killed. And after his murder, the probation officer entered multiple times thereafter nothing negative to report about this young man at this time. So this wasn't something made out of whole cloth. There were significant problems. We had youth development centers that were, to put it mildly, chaotic. But yet in the cases of what we prosecutors viewed as older, more violent kids, the solution was to send them there for the magical time period of 9 months. Because in 9 months, they would be ready to come home and be law-abiding. And we were seeing example after example where that was not playing out to be true.
Okay.
Keith, if I could just add, first of all, John, it didn't happen that way in Allegheny County at any time, just so you know. But my point, to take this back to 1994 when crime was rampant, just to put some numbers on it, Schumann Juvenile Detention Center has 120 beds, and 22 of those beds were taken up by kids accused of homicide. Back in those days, we kept youthful homicide offenders in our detention home as a courtesy to them and their families, rather than putting them into the county jail. But think about that in terms of 22 kids charged with homicide. September of 1994, our administrative judge at the time made the decision, enough is enough, they all go to the county jail, and from that point forward, that's where they ended up. But that's an awesome number to put this problem in perspective of 1990s.
Okay.
Keith, if I may.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. Wow.
There were 22 children that were accused of homicide, but at the same time, in what we called kiddie court at that time, there were victims of all those people that were deceased. So we were seeing people with very serious crimes that you might not see anymore, but they had no rights. So that was really important to me as a victim advocate.
All right, just one more word about the balanced and restorative justice language. Jim, if you would, where did that language actually come from? I mean, you just didn't make it up, right?
Well, we had the good fortune of having been introduced to Denny Maloney and his colleagues some years before that. In fact, the first person who I ever heard mention Denny Maloney's name was John Herb, our former director of training. And so we had been familiar with what was then called the balanced approach to juvenile probation initially. So we took those principles as a starting point, and at some point I drafted a legislative proposal around those principles. But they were the principles that Denny Maloney and his colleagues used as they were trying to make sense of what were juvenile justice systems in the beginning, which in his home state of Oregon and around the country. So a number of states had been exposed to that language. We were the first state to take that language and to craft it into a legislative proposal and have it become the basis for a juvenile justice system.
All right, thanks. All right, so we're beginning to start Act 2 now. That was Act 1. Act 2 is initial implementation of balanced and restorative justice. So now we're talking about 1996, the special session that occurred. We had 6 regional training sessions that the JCJC sponsored around the state. We had a summary of the legislation that Jim prepared. I still have copies of it. I think it's 36 pages of all kinds of amendments to the Juvenile Act. The chiefs created a balanced and restorative justice implementation committee. And also in 1996, Denny Maloney and Gordon Bazemore led a statewide policy forum to explain the underlying philosophy behind the new purpose clause. So we're starting to take steps to try to understand what this thing was. It's called balanced and restorative justice. Also, very significantly, I think, is that in 1996, Governor Ridge asked Ron Sharp to chair PCCD's Juvenile Advisory Committee. Again, that's the precursor to the JJDPC today. And he gave him a small job to do. Governor Ridge asked Ron to develop a strategic plan to take Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system into the next century. So, where did you start with that, Ron?
Well, I think we started where I would go with what Jim said about relationships. I'd known Mary since '78. She asked me to chair the advisory committee. First thing I said, that's fine with me as long as Jim is co-chair, and so for 18 years we did that together. And I think then we understood a couple things. We needed a statement, a charge from the governor to make us responsible for doing some work around balanced and restorative justice. And then I think the next thing that was most important was that we said we needed a new advisory committee. So we had 20 new members appointed to the committee, not one question about political affiliation, not one question at all about that. Then the next thing we decided, and I think the most important thing we decided is don't just do something, sit there. And so we sat for about a year every Thursday and Friday, starting 9 o'clock in the morning, going until 9 o'clock at night. Bob would play piano and entertain us in the evenings. And I think what we were able to do is to understand Deuteronomy, where there is no vision, the people perish, the system. We had an idea of what we wanted, but we had no clear goals. So the first thing we did was try to establish a mission statement, and actually worked out pretty well, because community protection, victim restoration, youth redemption is still the mission statement. And then we moved on to guiding principles, and those principles, of course, are still in place. So I think that was the framework of what we needed to do. We knew relationships were really important. We had no idea where we would go. We had no idea we'd be here 20 years later talking about this. But what we knew was the concept of sustained detention. Constant dripping hollows out a stone. That if we stayed with it long enough, we'd be able to develop something here in Pennsylvania that would reflect the best aspirations of everybody who is involved in the special legislative session.
Okay, so PCCD's Juvenile Advisory Committee was a central planning body to help lift this thing called balanced restorative justice. So Jim Anderson, Bob Schwartz, Ron Sharp, and Val Bender were actually members that were appointed to that, and John Delaney. So we have 5 members, and Susie were on the Juvenile Advisory Committee. So Val, turning to you for just a second. I'm sure juvenile justice professionals were batting your door down for the last 10 years, asking you to be part of everything. So explain to me about the call you got and what your perspective on all this.
I'll tell you my personal perspective. First, I thought they made a mistake because victim advocates were never invited to anything. So at my first juvenile justice meeting, I was like a duckling crossing the road without its mama duck for the first time. I was faced with these brilliant, articulate, experienced people, and all I really knew was the names, faces, and hearts of thousands of victims. I had served thousands of victims in direct service, literally in Allegheny County, so I knew the juvenile justice system, and I knew the victim service system. Restorative justice told us that we would have to have victim-centered processes in juvenile court. So when we adopted balanced and restorative justice in the victim restoration statement, we all incurred a responsibility to look at the services that we provided for victims and to assess their needs. So it was something very, very different for us, and it required collaboration. And we didn't play nice in the sandbox in the early days. It was very difficult. We had very strong people in both victim services and in juvenile justice, and we didn't have those relationships built yet. So we had to develop all those relationships, and I think we kept centered on what the needs of the victims were and what we needed to do. And that resulted, as far as I was concerned, in a lot of really interesting things that we were able to accomplish. A couple people talked about those regional trainings. Well, one aspect of those regional trainings was we brought Mothers Against Drunk Driving to the trainings, and the teams that were built were from each county, and for a lot of those teams, they had never actually heard from a victim before, and they didn't realize, if they had thought about it, they would have realized, but they weren't focused on it, that for a victim, the crime doesn't end the day the hearing is over. The trauma can go on for a long time. So that was something that really helped spur us on. I think I said before that victims didn't have rights in juvenile court, and they didn't at that time. I think John's going to talk a little bit about that process. But we had to have rights for victims because the way the law was worded, we just were really at the mercy of the court. So if we had a judge that would let victims talk in court, it happened. If we didn't, then the victims were speechless in court. We were lucky that we had funding at that time for restorative justice processes too, because we didn't know a lot about restorative justice. Mark Carrie talked today about those circles that they did in Charleston, and it's such a powerful vehicle for victims. And we were able to have training in circles, we had training in conferencing, so that we had training in mediation, and we were able to commission a lot of works, for instance, a victim offender conferencing manual, and it was all done based on collaboration. I think collaboration was the key to everything that we accomplished for victims, and the juvenile justice system led the way by inviting us in, and we were really grateful for that process, for them to do that. But we also had the expertise to work with the victims, so the collaboration was really critical.
All right, thanks. So Jim Reeland, so you were a chief probation officer at the time. You were a leader among the chiefs for a long time. And Rick Steele was the first chair, actually our own Rick Steele, the Chiefs Implementation Committee, and then you became chair. So you're a chief and you're trying to figure out how to do this thing called balanced restorative justice, right?
Right.
So how did that work?
Well, it worked well at times and not so well at times, because we had to figure out what this meant. All I could tell my staff at the time was the part of this that is not debatable is that it's the law. What is debatable is how we achieve the purpose of the new law. And when we would hear stories from Dennis Maloney and others talking about how we now have to serve victims as our client, as a probation officer, and those were the words that were used, and you now have, obviously, the offender is your client, and you also have now this thing called the community as your client. So as you're sitting there as a probation officer, whether you have 10 cases or 150, you're saying, okay, how do I do this? You know, so it really became a mysterious process. But through the leadership in the state, and let me make a comment because Carrie mentioned it this morning, and I think it's one of the dramatic differences between Pennsylvania and many other states in the country. We're fortunate to have a juvenile court judges commission. Every state does not have one of those, and I think here we assume that so much of what we do, everyone else does, but that doesn't exist everywhere. Having a strong council of chief juvenile probation officers and having local control, having counties having the ability to determine on their own how they're going to accomplish the goals, building in the relationships that we all have. And I've always said, I can pick up the phone and talk to a DA, John Delaney, or Bob Schwartz if I want to get into an argument. But the thing about Pennsylvania was you had the ability to do that. And so when I looked at how you do this, it's about the relationships. So through Susie's guidance in terms of putting together our implementation committee, we brought in all of these different constituencies and started having the discussion. And I mentioned to Val, I remember a really distinct discussion / argument between a victim advocate and a juvenile court judge who was on, no, it wasn't Val, but just in terms of coming from different perspectives and trying to figure out, okay, I'm a judge in a courtroom, and you're saying I have to do these things now for a victim. I don't know how I do that. You know, we're saying, I already do that. I don't have to learn anything new. I don't have to do anything different. I already do that in the course of my job. So I think we really just struggled in terms of the implementation committee. But at some point, the light bulb went off and said, you know, we should start writing something down. And so from those thoughts, the white papers, and I would encourage all of you in the room today to go back and read the 3 white papers on community protection and victimization and competency development. And we'll talk more about competency development in a little while. But I think what really got us together and is just the, you know, Ron said you sit and think. Well, we sat and thought every quarter for years in terms of how you build this, how you change it, how you then can go back to your probation department and say, here's a new thought that we have. And without droning on here further, Keith, I will say this. When Val said, you know, that she didn't know how to address those of us in the probation world, we also weren't real well schooled in addressing victims. So one of the things we did in Allegheny County was we, with the assistance of our victim agency, was required that all of our probation staff would go through a victim impact panel. And that was probably one of the most powerful things we did, because I'm sitting there listening, and all of a sudden my staff's talking about these horrific crimes that occurred, you know, to them. And I'm like, wow, we didn't, we had no idea of this stuff going on. So all of those things we learned by talking with our victim partners as
Very
we
good,
went through
thanks.
this.
So, Susie, I'll move to you. So in '96, I believe you were the CNY administrator, chief adult probation officer, chief juvenile probation officer, and you also were administering Somerset County's training program. And when the Balanced Restorative Justice was enacted, you fully embraced that. And then in 1998, you joined our staff. And as Mark Carey spoke this morning about a shot of adrenaline, I think you were the shot of adrenaline in the system to really push balanced and restorative justice forward. So why don't you talk about what you remember from the early days?
Thank you, Keith. Well, as you heard already, what a huge task, leading the charge in balanced and restorative justice. What was my role, though? Actually, I will tell you some that people would say I was a cheerleader. Some would say I was the burr in the side constantly, but I like to refer to myself as a choreographer because my role was to choreograph a lot of different things in Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system in terms of first understanding what this barge thing is. I mean, as Jim reflected, we didn't have a guide for what balanced and restorative justice was or how to implement it, just as we didn't have a guide for JJSES. However, we knew that we had to address this in a statewide fashion with 67 counties that had 67 operating systems. And then we had to look at Pennsylvania and the juvenile justice system and say, ooh, we have to have a new operating system here based on the new legislation which encompasses balanced and restorative justice. So we truly needed to look at change at different levels. We needed to look at the systemic changes that needed to happen, which were the statewide changes and approaches that we needed to do. We also needed organizational change, which was at the local level, which Jim referred to in Allegheny County, what they did. And then we had to look at the individual case level and how what we were going to be doing with balanced and restorative justice impacted our offenders and now victims. So it was quite interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the balanced and restorative the early balanced and restorative justice implementation committee because it was so instrumental in bringing together folks to dialogue and debate and try to figure out what this beast was. I will tell you that one of the strongest things we did in Pennsylvania at that point in time was to include immediately upfront crime victim advocates on our implementation team. We were very, very inclusive. That didn't happen in all states. And it was a very big strength. So we did that. We had when we expanded the membership, we had all the stakeholders on the implementation committee. We had community members, we had religious organizations, we had judges, DAs, and we did a lot of work. Originally, what we did was a strategic plan and came together and said, well, we need to continue to study this. So how do we do this? Well, we set up several committees. One was the Victim Services Committee because we had no clue what we were going to do with how to implement services or look at victims as our client. So we implemented that as a subcommittee, and the court and community collaboration. How do we do this court and collaboration? And many chiefs, probation officers were involved in these particular committees and did so much work to move this along. So in a systemic fashion, that's how I would say that we approached it. So choreographing all that was very, very, very fun. The interesting thing, integrated into the structure of the Chiefs Council were those original committees: the Balanced Restorative Justice Committee, the Victim Services Committee, Court and Community Collaboration Committee, and actually the PR Committee came out of the Balanced and Restorative Justice Committee as well. and the website was initiated through that particular committee. And then, as everyone has said, it's been training, technical assistance, education, and policy development to get it to the level of where we used or where we implemented balanced and restorative justice in the individual cases. We work through policy, and if you put it in practice, it will happen. That was Judge Casamatis, wasn't it, Jim? If we put it in practice, it will happen, and that's what we did. So we helped counties and worked with counties to develop practices and policies around even case planning. I mean, although it's different than the case planning we're doing now, it was conditions of probation. At least they were in the three categories of community protection and accountability and youth. I get the mission statement mixed up too. Competency development, which I think JJSES has really pushed forward tremendously.
All right, so we're going to finish this segment with some discussion about initial implementation efforts. I'm going to open it up to the panel. So, are there any big ticket things that happened during that time that you think really helped push implementation forward? Jim?
For me, yeah, the other part of what we were doing in Allegheny County is the light bulb also went off to say we should be talking about outcomes. And one of the things that Dennis Maloney always said when he addressed this group or other groups that I was privileged to be around him for was that we don't want our system in the future to be identified or evaluated through anecdotal tragedies. And until you figure out how to collect your outcomes and demonstrate case-by-case probation caseload, supervisor caseload, or by the whole system, you will continue to be that. So, you know, balanced restorative justice for me really lent itself to us developing a system of outcomes, which today we have pretty routinely accepted. So you're able to determine, did a youth in the period of probation pay his restitution or not? Did he do his community service or not? Did he go to victim awareness or not? Did he reoffend or not? And so by collecting that information, we were able to tabulate and be able to then put out a report card to the community that said, here it is. You know, it's not perfect. We have room to grow and develop, but these, in fact, are our outcomes. So we were able to say 75 or 80% or 90%, whatever it was, of youth who were ordered to pay restitution paid. Prior to that, and again, depending on how old you are in the system, in the past we would collect data on how much money we collected annually. So you collected $100,000, you say, eventually I said, so what does that actually mean? For me, what it really started to mean was if the court ordered a child to pay $100 in restitution, did he pay it or not? That's the question, and that's the question that we should be judged on in the system. Did the child reoffend or not?
So we took your model. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was saying, you finished that thought.
I was going to say, we took Jim's model in Allegheny and actually created
I just think
our own
it's so important to talk about the importance of PCCD and the appointment of Tom Corbett as chair of PCCD by Governor Ridge, and then the strength of what was the JAC and ultimately the JJDPC, but also PCCD's staff and the commitment of the PCCD as a body to allocate more than just the juvenile money to juvenile justice issues. Most states struggle with juvenile justice funding, especially that come through the state advisory group and the juvenile committees like our JJDPC. They just have this small amount of money that would come to each of the states. But in PCCD, through Tom Corbett's leadership, the juvenile system would get access to other funding that came through PCCD. And we had tremendous support over the years from PCCD and PCCD's staff listening to what the people in the system and what the members of the JJDPC were saying. And then, of course, the governor, and through Mary as the policy director, getting specialized probation funding in the budget and getting money to the counties for the balanced and restorative justice specialists and the money for the white papers. That was all federal money that came through PCCD.
And that money continues today. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to add two things. One, people have talked about the importance of relationships, and I agree with that, but I think we also have to note the importance of leadership. Ron Sharp is never going to say this because he's too modest, but his ability to put people in a room and get them talking was nothing short of incredible. And we would meet for 6 times a year for a day and a half at a time. So the other thing, in addition to leadership, is work. I mean, we had to ask Bob Schwartz to take time out of his busy schedule suing county commissioners and secretaries of welfare and other folks to sit down and talk. And while he and I disagree violently on the whole concept of direct filing, we agreed to put that aside because the other 98 out of every 100 kids are going to remain in the juvenile justice system. So we decided there are some things we can't agree on, we'll set them aside. But how do we work together on things we can agree on? And the commitment of people to do that, I think, is something that it's important that we understand and we restate. Because at one point, I said to my wife, I'm going to resign from the DA's office because I need to go on the PCCD payroll. I was spending so much time in Harrisburg and emailing and sending drafts of the white papers back and forth and collaborating with all the folks to make this stuff happen. It seems easy now when you look in retrospect, but at the time, it was a group of dedicated people with an excellent leader that made most of this stuff happen.
And I would just add, a year after the governor charged us with developing the strategic plan, we met with the governor, and I had expected he would have maybe reviewed our recommendations or maybe even had considered, but he had digested them. And we met with him for an hour and a half, and we had his full attention. So we didn't have the governor marginally involved. We had him fully committed, which led to a lot of the changes that we've seen. I think that's really important.
Thank you, Ron. That was leadership. Thank you. The last segment is going to be talking more about present day. And so I'm going to start with Russell Carlino, who's currently the chief in Allegheny County. He serves as the chair of the Balanced Restorative Justice NJJSES committee. So Russ, take us to present day now. We heard from Mark this morning, but your perspectives on where we've come from.
Well, first of all, Rick is the co-chair. As the JJSES committee was merged with Balanced Restorative Justice, we co-chair that, and that actually was interesting in and of itself. We had discussion off and on for a couple of years about whether or not we wanted to merge JJSES, the committee, with the Balanced Restorative Justice Committee, and we decided that the work was so interrelated that it made sense to merge those two committees, and so that's what we've done. But as Jim Reeland said, one thing's for sure, Balanced Restorative Justice is the law, it's the legislative mandate, it's our mission, and that we know. And so that is our sights are always fixed on those goals. But how we achieve that is really what changes over time. And just as Jim described in the early days, what does it mean to do accountability? How do you include victims? How do you protect the community? How do you develop competencies in youth? Those questions remain, and I think what JJSES has done is really what Mark said this morning. It really was a shot of adrenaline because it really changed the role of the probation officer, the role of the system, the role of providers in actually how they operate, how they function with youth. The things that we do now, the structured decision-making tools that we have available weren't available back then. So when we talk about detention risk assessment or the YLS, those structured decision-making tools help us move forward, help us make decisions that protect the community ultimately and develop competencies in youth. So, it's been a steady progress, and it's been a logical progression really when you look at where we were in the early days, the white papers which really served such an important role in the development of this monograph that everybody was issued as part of the conference. But you'll see the highlight in there of the white papers and the role they play, not just then, the role they played then, but the role that the white papers play today as well. Certainly if you look at the community protection goal, for example, we talk about identifying the risk, managing the risk, and minimizing the risk. So when we talk about identifying the risk, Pat Torbert was, she was spot on with that. But what we have now to identify the risk is the YLS or the Padre. So when we talk about managing the risk, how do we do that? Well, certainly we want to restrict liberty. We want to provide some surveillance. We want to have controls. But that's only short term. That doesn't do anything long term. So those are important aspects. But ultimately, you want to minimize that risk. And what does that mean today? That means that we have long-term internal change in the youth through cognitive behavioral interventions. So when you map it out and when you look at where we were in the past and what the white papers outlined and how far we've come with JJSES, It's really amazing. It's been a lot of work, and we certainly have a lot more work to do, but we're certainly proud of where we are and our ability to achieve the balanced and restorative justice goals through JJSES.
If I may say, a term that we used at the beginning of balanced and restorative justice, and I believe it's still applicable, is it's an evolution, not a revolution. And to look at the past 20 years, how far we have come from not really understanding balanced and restorative justice and crafting it for our own Pennsylvania model based on assistance and from the national experts. Well, we crafted it for Pennsylvania, and that's what I see, this advancement of balanced and restorative justice through JJSES. Ne'er to forget our victim restoration goal and what we need to continue to do based on the rights of crime victims and the rules of delinquency procedure. It's
All right.
Shot in the arm. And that was your quote, by the way. I know I didn't have anything to do with that.
All right, we're
Adrenaline.
gonna wrap up this segment with Judge Clark and Judge Grimm to talk about how all this actually plays out in the courtroom. So, is it real? Is it alive? How's it working for both of you?
Yeah, I'll start, but I just want to say this. I've found this fascinating to hear about what has transpired.
Try your mic.
I find this fascinating to hear about what has transpired, but if this afternoon were nothing more than a walk down memory lane, it would probably equate to what John Nance Garner said the vice presidency was worth under Franklin Roosevelt. Those of you who are history buffs may remember he said it's not worth a bucket of warm spit. Well, this is worth a lot more than that, because what it shows is that organizationally, the juvenile justice system in Pennsylvania is comprised of hardworking, bright, articulate, passionate, committed people who know one another, who have relationships. And there will be other challenges. The positive challenge of 1995 was followed by the troublesome challenge of 2005 and the problem in Luzerne County. But the system was able to come together and to deal with that issue well because of precisely the same factors that were at work in 1995. We know each other, we convene, we come together, we share, we respect one another. And a big part of it is this conference in November and the fact that all of you are sitting there. A big part of it, in my opinion, is the very structure of the Juvenile Court Judges Commission, a judicial commission underneath the governor. It allows us to be active and proactive and to speak out about issues that concern us. And that kind of issue is not only a JCJC up to the legislature and the governor, but also as juvenile court judges, the ability to engage communities in the work that we do. And we do that, and we did that in 1995. I was blessed to have, and still have, a juvenile probation office in Berks County with wonderful leadership and people who are up to the challenge and ready to change, because change is really what it's all about. So I just would, again, echo the sentiment that we are part of an evolutionary process. There will be challenges that will come along. If it's every 10 years, get ready, folks, because it's coming this year. But hopefully the challenges will be ones that are surmountable, and with our system in place, we'll be able to do it. The Juvenile Court Judges Commission is great. The Juvenile Court, the Chiefs Association is fantastic. We're primed and ready for the future.
All right, Judge Clark.
So I came on the bench in '99, so balanced and restorative justice was about 4 years old. It was in place, but it was still pretty new. My background had been as a prosecutor, so I was thrilled with the concept of a mission that included a voice for the victims, for example, and all of the other things that balanced and restorative justice encompasses. But it was still a little rocky, because still some of the defense lawyers and public defenders that had been around a while, who had been working in the juvenile court long before I came on, had not fully embraced balanced and restorative justice. And, you know, with new judges, they like to tell you how to do your job, which is good because I can see that, you know, they probably knew more about the juvenile justice system than I did, having never worked there. So it was a process to get people to fully embrace the concept of balanced and restorative justice. But how I see it playing out now is that from my perspective as the judge, balanced and restorative justice is still the mission of the juvenile court in Pennsylvania. So it's my job to make sure that whatever I order, so that the disposition reflects the Pennsylvania mission of balanced and restorative justice. So whatever dispositional order I enter, whatever I say to a child or his parents as they're sitting there in the courtroom or when the victim is sitting there, should reflect those principles of balanced and restorative justice. And I have to think about that. I think now with JJSES, it really has made my job a little bit easier. It's given me better tools to address that. So our probation officers do a good job in writing in their predispositional reports, and in their dispositional review reports, those things, there will be a section that says community safety and protection, and one that says victim accountability, and one that says competency development. But how it plays out a little bit differently is now that, you know, prior to JJSES, I might look at the area of community safety and protection, and maybe to me that means something more harsh than the YLS tells me that I need, or in terms of making a decision about detention prior to adjudication. I have a better tool to help me determine how to address the issue of community safety and protection, because I have an objective tool to tell me this kid should not be detained or this kid should be detained. Or post-disposition, the YLS will tell me that this kid is a low risk or a high risk or a moderate risk or extremely high risk. So that tells me what I need to do, whether I need placement, secure placement, some day treatment program, or just probation with some restrictions or conditions of supervision that might affect the issue of community safety and protection. So it tells me, but identifies criminogenic needs and other needs. It tells me what I need to do with the areas of victim awareness and accountability, how to address the issues of competency development. Does this kid need a lot of work on moral reasoning and social skills? Is this kid going to school? Is that an issue? Is there a substance abuse issue? So it really helps me to address the mission of the juvenile court, and I think we're just getting better and better at it. We still have a long ways to go, but we are getting better. I have much better tools to help me do my job. I think the probation officers have much better tools and much better information to give the court recommendations, and it helps me, it gives me a better way to communicate the reasons for my dispositional order or my decisions to the people that are in the courtroom. Most importantly, to the juvenile who's going to be under supervision, but also to his family. Parents want to know, why is the judge doing this? What does all this mean? And also to a victim, because sometimes victims, it's really personal to them. They've been injured, they've been harmed, and sometimes it really helps to understand why maybe they think this kid should be locked up, but it gives me a way to explain to them why I'm not going to do that, that I understand their issues, but we think we can keep them safe and address their concerns with this kind of disposition because we have more objective tools. So I think it's playing out really well in the courtroom.
Thank you. I want to reserve about 5 minutes for something a little special at the end of the program, but that leaves us with about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes for any final comments, any challenges that you'd like to speak to for moving forward. Bob Schwartz.
Yeah, and this is, I think, a pretty exciting 20 years of getting from where we were to here, and I think folks in the state should be fairly proud, very proud of where we've gotten to. I would say that there are two things that I think might require a little more focused attention. I know that we have a relatively easy time of measuring things like restitution or community service. So the report cards, I think, have been less well developed when it comes to the competency development piece, and I think for good reasons. It's really hard to figure out how a kid makes progress in, as Judge Clark said, the moral reasoning skills, pro-social skills, workforce development skills, independent living skills, the kind of things that are part of the domains that are in the white papers. And I do go back to these white papers that were written by some folks here, but largely by Pat Torbett, the late, great Pat Torbett, who should be on this panel and probably is in her way. 2005, 6, and 8, there were 3 of these came out, so they're relatively recent. The victim restoration, public safety, and accountability parts and public safety are well developed in terms of measurements. We can do a better job, and I think the JJSES venture going forward needs to do that. The other thing that I would just mention, because I think it's, I felt that I lost this argument too 20 years ago, and this gives me another bite at the apple, is that, well, you never give up, John.
You don't.
It's the Notre Dame fight song, you know. Is when we developed on the JJDPC the mission statement for the system, which incorporated the balanced and restorative justice 3 goals of youth redemption, victim restoration, and public safety. I really felt strongly at the time that we also had to have a 4th goal that encompassed fairness, which has a variety of measures from being well represented by counsel to racial and ethnic justice, proportionality of sentencing. There are varieties of ways that fairness is in play. And we incorporated that as a additional paragraph that was almost a rider to the bill, but we haven't measured it. We haven't reported on it. And I've often thought that Luzerne County might have turned out differently had there been a public and more accountable way of thinking about representation of kids in juvenile court all along the way. So that the information wasn't buried. I think we could do a better job of reporting on fairness and would still urge us to rethink the mission to include that. It's important for kids. It's important for the rest of us as well.
Thank you. And in rebuttal, John Delaney.
No, unlike the legislative chair, I agree with everything Bob Schwartz just said. And I would add one important thing. This has to be constantly attended to. One of the things that came out of this, and I'd be remiss if I didn't note that Donna Gordy, the former commissioner of Blair County, was a charter member of the JJDPC, and so it just shows you the breadth of people we had around the table, somebody who was responsible for going back home and finding money in her budget to do this stuff. But in 2000, we finally got the legislature to amend the Crime Victims Act, because the Crime Victims Act was written in criminal court language, conviction, sentence. It was amended to include rights for victims of juvenile offenders, and thus created another acronym of VOJO. And the legislature at the time appropriated $3.6 million so that counties could provide those rights to juvenile victims. And 5 years ago, the governor zeroed that out of the budget. And it's been a constant battle since then to replace that money. So it's a good thing to celebrate 20 years of what I would characterize as significant progress, but it's only through constant attention that we're going to keep what we have and build on it. And the most important thing in doing that, I think, is the recruitment and retention of quality people like the people in this room. Because doing what you do is very difficult, and very few of the people you do it for will thank you. But the 3 constituencies that you serve, the community, crime victims, and juvenile offenders, all benefit greatly by everything that you bring to work every day. So on behalf of them who don't thank you, I would like to say thank you.
Thank you, John. Okay, go ahead, Val.
Victim services is a really young field, but I think in order for us to improve our services and make sure that we're providing the services that victims still need, we need to do a lot better job of collecting data and analyzing the data, and then having a feedback loop so that we can look at the service we're providing and make sure they're still relevant for today. We started these services 20 years ago, and people and times have changed. Are we delivering those services in a way that's appropriate to the victims now? So I think that's a challenge for us.
Thank you. Ron Sharp.
As Susie said, Barge is really an evolution, not a revolution. And to that end, Ms. Renee Williams, who's our Barge coordinator at ARC, is in the back of the room. And she worked with Susie to develop an evidence-based, highly CBT, highly interactive Barge curriculum for youth in the juvenile justice system. And she has copies back there. Be delighted if you took one with you and see if there's anything in there that'll help us continue with the evolution of Barge in Pennsylvania.
All right, thank you. I'm going to move forward. Judge Clark, would you join me at the podium?
Yes.
Denny Maloney, for those who know him, was not only a guide and a mentor for us, but a friend. He was just a really good guy who unfortunately died unexpectedly. And I'd like to ask Judge Clark to make a special presentation in his honor. Thank you.
So, yes, and it was really exciting this morning seeing all the slides with pictures of Denny Maloney and having had the privilege to know him and work with him. And I still remember who told me that he died. It was John Delaney. We were at the Hotel Hershey, and I was devastated. I will never forget it. It's like, where were you when Kennedy was assassinated, or where were you on 9/11? So I still remember that. So I'm very honored to make this presentation. Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system lost a dear friend on February 6, 2007, when Dennis Maloney collapsed while driving in his hometown of Bend, Oregon, and later died. He was only 55 years old. Denny, as he was known to many of us, was last in Harrisburg to deliver the keynote address at our 2006 Conference on Juvenile Justice. The theme for that conference was celebrating a decade of commitment to achieving a balanced and restorative juvenile justice system, 1996 to 2006. And the prominent role that Denny played throughout the conference was indeed fitting. Although he never lived in Pennsylvania, very few individuals have had a more profound impact upon Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system than Denny Maloney. Denny first began working in Pennsylvania in the 80s when he passionately advocated for the principles of community protection, accountability, youth competency development, individualized assessment of each youth, and system balance. More than 10 years before any legislative mandates regarding these principles, Denny Maloney stressed that justice is best served when the community, the crime victim, and the juvenile offender receive balanced attention and each gain tangible benefits from their interactions with the juvenile justice system. Following the enactment of Act 33, Denny served as the keynote speaker at our 1966 conference. That program was entitled Community, Victim, and Offender, Changing Roles in Juvenile Justice. The 1996 keynote address was the cornerstone of the system reform efforts that continue today in Pennsylvania. Denny continued to visit Pennsylvania to work with key leaders that comprised the initial Balance and Restorative Justice Committee of the Pennsylvania Council of Chief Juvenile Probation Officers. He traveled extensively through the nation, and during his presentations, he spoke frequently about the work being accomplished in Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system. During his keynote address at the 2006 conference, I'm getting very emotional here reading about Denny, I'm sorry, which he entitled Celebrating the Journey, the Role of Pennsylvania in Shaping Juvenile Justice Policy in America, he detailed the important work that has been done since the passage of Act 33 and stated emphatically that it was his sincere belief that the Pennsylvania juvenile justice system will be to the next 100 years what Cook County, Illinois, the home of the world's first juvenile court, was to the first 100 years of our nation's juvenile court movement. No one had a better perspective on the work that we had been doing here in Pennsylvania than Denny. Indeed, Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system is a better place because of Denny Maloney. In recognition of his profound impact on our system and in the lives of many of us who had the privilege of working with him, the Juvenile Court Judges Commission and the Pennsylvania Council of Chief Probation Officers established the Dennis M. Maloney Award in 2007 to periodically honor individuals who have made truly exceptional contributions to Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system. The first presentation of the award was made in 2007 to Judge Ken Bean. The memorable event was highlighted by the attendance of Denny's wife, Dr. Nancy Maloney, and their oldest daughter, Tracy, who traveled from Oregon. That evening, a contribution of $10,000 was made to the educational fund. Oh, I can't. Yeah, come up here and help me, Keith. For Denny's 5 daughters, Tracy and her sisters Shannon, Caitlin, Kelly, and Molly. The second Dennis Maloney Award was presented in 2009 to Jim Reetland, who at that time was director of Allegheny County Juvenile Probation Department. During Jim's years of distinguished service with Allegheny County, he developed a reputation as a visionary leader and mentor to colleagues throughout Pennsylvania. He led Pennsylvania's entire juvenile justice system in our efforts to achieve the statutory mission of our Juvenile Act that had its philosophical foundation in the work of Denny Maloney. This afternoon, it gives me great pleasure to announce that the third recipient of the Dennis M. Maloney Award is Susan L. Blackburn. Come on up, Susan.
Congratulations, Susan. Outstanding. Outstanding.
So, Susie Blackburn is perhaps the most passionate advocate for balanced and restorative justice in the nation. She has been a staunch supporter of victims' rights and services, has developed relationships with many of the victims' community, and has advocated on their behalf to all Pennsylvania juvenile justice system stakeholders. Her vision, energy, and commitment to achieving a balanced and restorative juvenile justice system in Pennsylvania has continued unabated since her days as the Chief Juvenile Probation Officer in Somerset County and throughout her tenure as Pennsylvania's Balanced and Restorative Justice Specialist. Susie, in honor of Denny Maloney and on behalf of the Juvenile Court Judges Commission and the Pennsylvania Council of Chief Probation Officers, it is with great pleasure, and I really mean that, with great pleasure, that I present to you the Dennis M. Maloney Award in recognition of your extraordinary leadership and dedicated service to Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system. And if I can lift it up. And it reads, this is presented by the Juvenile Court Judges Commission and the Pennsylvania Council of Chief Juvenile Probation Officers to Susan L. Blackburn in recognition of extraordinary leadership and service to Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system, November 5th, 2015. Congratulations.
Wow. Wow, I had no idea. This is like incredible. Thank you to all of the leaders in Pennsylvania who have made balanced and restorative justice happen. It wasn't an easy job, or it wasn't easy to leave beautiful Somerset County and come to live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. But I did have a passion. It took me over. It's my journey in life. I was destined, and spurred on initially by, of course, Denny and Gordon. Met many national leaders through balanced and restorative justice who helped us to understand balanced and restorative justice better, help me understand it better, and spur my passion. And all of you that have worked in this system and made it move forward. I'm a choreographer. I just move people around where they fit best and programs where they fit best, and just love you all.
We love
Thanks.
you too.